It gives me great pleasure to announce Dr. John Briere, Ph.D. He's an associate professor of psychiatry and psychology at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California, and is the center director of the USC-ATTC of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. He's also past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. He's recipient of an award for outstanding contributions to science of trauma psychology from the American Psychological Association. He teaches on trauma, therapy, and mindfulness practices internationally. Please welcome Dr. John Briere.
Good morning. So I'm just going to briefly describe some of why we're doing these things. One of the things that some of you know and some of you will be continuously appraised of is the fact that a part of what this entire program is about is not only working with complex trauma and working with traumatized kids, but also acknowledging and addressing the fact that most of the kids that we see are socially marginalized, come from oppressed or maltreated groups of people who their experiences of societal detriment are interacting with their histories of childhood maltreatment. So I'm going to try to just talk a little to you about the notion of complex trauma, why we probably think that it would be a good idea to focus on this as much as possible, and then to highlight just a few of the issues associated with social marginalization, which is such a prominent issue with a lot of the kids and adolescents that we work with. So I think Cheryl mentioned this very briefly, but when we talk about complex trauma for today, what we'll be talking about is the experience of having been maltreated in multiple ways at multiple times throughout the lifespan up to whatever age you are now. So for adolescents, this would often involve not only victimization experiences during their adolescence, but also previous childhood trauma experiences, and not only just childhood trauma experiences, but often difficulties with caretaker child attachment associated with either psychologically or physically unavailable parents at all, or parents who, for various reasons, ranging from their own psychological difficulties to the ways that they negotiated their own attachment experiences as children. You may have parents who have trouble forming a safe, secure connection. They may have disattunement problems. They may not be psychologically available to that child. This has, of course, made our trauma area more complex, although more interesting. It also informs us enough that we can start doing interventions we hadn't done before. The realization that probably for many of the traumatized kids that you see, it won't just be that they're in a gang or they're being exploited by the sex industry or that they're homeless. Or it'll also be what their early experiences were like, which are going to interact with their current experiences. And it's not only going to be that, it's going to be sort of the, people like to say, the hidden wounds of early attachment dysregulation. And the more that we've come to realize that, the more we've understood that if we want to address maltreated youth, we probably don't just work with their current experiences or even their child abuse experiences, but also their very early experiences of neglect, etc. So you see some of the things that are often characterized by complex trauma. This will especially involve childhood sexual and physical abuse, but an awful lot of the kids we see, especially in gang contexts, are experienced peer violence. Young women and men who are being raped and sexually assaulted by their peers or others in their environment. Community violence, which waxes and wanes. It's currently not as intense as it has been, but that doesn't mean that it's gone away. And also the exposure to other people's violence, both in terms of kids seeing violence in their own families, but also many of us have dealt with situations where kids are exposed to community violence that they witness involving people being shot. One of the things that was actually a bit of a wake-up call for me, because I work in various areas and hadn't focused quite as much on on this sort of thing a couple decades ago, was the realization that an awful lot of the kids we see are also mourning on some level. They have some traumatic grieving associated with the loss of friends, watching their kids, fellow kids being shot in schoolyard environments or in community violence, etc. Just as 9/11 sort of catalyzed the mental health community's awareness of traumatic grieving, so as we get drilled more deeply down into the experience of the kids that we're working with in the community context in which they find themselves, the more we find that they're not only suffering post-traumatic stress and attachment difficulties, etc. Many of them are also grieving a wide variety of things, including even waking up to the realization that you're being marginalized by virtue of your gender or your race or your ethnicity or who you want to have sex with or whoever it might be. That the realization of those social phenomena can produce a suffering that is not well defined by DSM, but is nevertheless very powerful. The reason that ITCT-A focuses and ITCT-C focuses on marginalization is because, of course, if you go to the average trauma center or the average emergency room, pediatric emergency room, or you go to a county mental health center, or you go to anything, and you look in the waiting room, what you typically will see will not be upper middle class white kids. What you'll be seeing are people who have gotten the short end of a variety of different sticks that have come together in some kind of situation that not only produces low accessibility for them to get mental health services, but when they get them, they're probably not going to be the same exact social matrix of the therapist that's about to see them. And part of what we've really tried to do is make the interventions that we engage in appropriate to various contextual factors, including race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, transgender status, whatever it might be, because those issues are very powerful in the room of our work. And there's no benefit to blaming people, but there has been a tendency in our field to overlook these critical social factors and then be bemused by the dropout rates that we see, or the fact that our clients are not psychologically minded enough to access our brilliant therapeutic technology, when it may be that they can't relate to anything that we're doing because we're speaking on another wavelength that's not that related to them. So to just summarize that slide, what we typically see for the average adolescent who would be of interest for us today would be a kid who probably was born into an environment where there were difficulties in parental functioning such that the parents may have been disintuned or disengaged. We have some new research coming out, I think in about a year. It's not published yet, so I can't talk about it too much. But we have found by using new measures of disengagement, for example, that in a study that we're just finishing now, actually parental disengagement is predicting more symptomatology in young adults than childhood physical or sexual abuse. And that's kind of spooky in a way because these are acts of omission and they're very subtle and we're not always able to track, did your mother love you a lot? Was your father psychologically present? Those are not going to be things that we can do easy on an assessment algorithm, and yet those are turning out to be very important. Just as the Egelin, Sroof, Carlson data sets from the Minnesota Child Development Study showed that if you followed the children who had disattuned, what they called psychologically unavailable caretakers, those kids actually had the worst outcomes, even worse than the ones who'd had physical and sexual abuse. Now, this isn't a horse race, but it just reminds us that what we need to look at is both acts of commission and omission, and then be aware that the kids who are in that jam are also typically embedded in psychosocial frameworks that marginalize them and are associated with deprivation and maltreatment. So we have to, when we diagnose complex trauma exposure, we believe very firmly that we also have to look at social inequity as part of that. So I don't know how much you'll hear about this today, but I actually think it's a cool thing that in our treatment for both adolescent and for child in ITCT-A, it's entirely appropriate and even a focus of some of the work that people don't just talk about how they were raped or battered or hurt, etc., but they actually will express and process in groups the experience of being raised in a racist culture or in a culture that's marginalizing you because of your gender orientation or sexual orientation. So we actually treat those as traumas. And some of my colleagues who talk about post-slavery syndromes, we're very akin to that because we're looking at Native American kids who their parents and families have undergone near cultural annihilation through the boarding school experiences, et cetera, immigrants from various countries, I do think, although you can get angry and not notice this, but I do think America does a fairly good job with immigrants compared to a lot of countries, although I think Europe is ahead of us. But the reality is also we're not that hospitable. An awful lot of the people that we see here who come in from other countries are experiencing not only whatever they left that country to come here about, but also when they get here, they may find themselves in situations that are not going to be as helpful to them, and they may, in fact, accrue additional trauma. So we even have people in this room who specialize in unaccompanied youth across the Mexican-American border, and that presents a whole dynamic of what are the experiences of those kids. And when they went across the border, were they sexually or physically victimized by coyotes? Or were they maltreated in some other kind of way that's very powerful, such that by the time they come to us, they've got this complexity of all that stuff. So bottom line, we call it complex trauma for a reason. And the more we do research in this area, the more we find there's more variables we have to study. Research and treatment in the area of complex trauma teaches humility, because you start to realize there's no way you're going to figure this out. What you try to do is do the best you can, given this flood of different things going on at the same time. And you try to do your best not to ignore major variables like culture that will make a big difference. So you put all that stuff into a barrel and you roll it around, and then the output is this slide, which is the complex trauma, and by the way, the complex post-traumatic outcomes, or the common effects of complex trauma, are very wide, and so some people have referred to some parts of that group as complex PTSD or some kind of a relational trauma. The ICD-11, I know some of you are struggling with starting ICD-10, but ICD-11 will actually have complex PTSD as a diagnostic category. So things are getting very interesting out there. But the reality is that there are no real syndromal presentations that describe all the experiences of childhood maltreatment. So, I mean, I don't represent everybody, but as a status multivariate researcher, my view is not that we think there's a syndrome of complex post-traumatic outcomes. What there is a big, complex, multivariate world of a million different symptoms that are going to vary as a function of your own history, culture, attachment experience, specific configuration of abusive experiences, etc. So everybody's going to have something different. Probably there is no developmental trauma syndrome, and the notion that you got 2 of these, 3 of these, 5 of these, and then you have a diagnosis. Probably what we have are hurt kids who are hurt in a variety of different ways, and we probably have to be multivariate statisticians even to provide the treatment for that, because it means that we have to consider a lot of things simultaneously. So anxiety, depression, and anger are the big ones, obviously, in terms of obvious impacts. Of those, anger is interesting in that the DSM doesn't really address anger very much, and yet anger is associated with a huge amount of the difficulties that humans encounter. I think psychological theory in the United States and North America and Europe, as well as Buddhist psychology, would tell you actually that anger is not something to be suppressed, but it's also one of the most potentially problematic affective states. So what we have to do is find some way to work with angry people that will be helpful. And in my experience, hurt people tend to be sad, mad, and scared. And it's the mad part that we miss a lot. And so, but when we're working with the marginalized adolescent who may be pissed off about a million different things that have happened to her or him, we're going to have to address that anger issue a little bit more. So we try to do that. Post-traumatic stress, obviously, dissociation very commonly. Although, in work that I do in sex trafficking of adults and torture, we don't always find that the clients that we see have the common courtesy to read the DSM-5 before they present. So they may not actually present with PTSD, yet they may be very, very traumatized. Different cultures have different idioms of distress, different ways of expressing their difficulties, and not every culture has PTSD as their headline outcome. For instance, in Puerto Rico, it might be ataque de nervios. Ataques are actually probably equivalent epidemiologically to PTSD, but if you saw someone here having ataques, you'd give them Dilantin. You'd treat it as a seizure disorder or something, depending on how severe the presentation was. So one of the problems with defining these things in terms of the nosology of America, or of North America, or European countries in general, is that we miss an awful lot, so don't take any of this to the bank. Attachment dysregulation is a big deal, obviously, and attachment dysregulation produces difficulties in identity, affect regulation, schema, relatedness, all kinds of things that we have to deal with. They're often the things that in earlier DSMs were referred to as personality disorders, especially the cluster B, or the unstable personality disorders. And of course, the reigning king or queen of that cluster was borderline personality disorder. DSM-5 is actually a traffic accident around Axis 2, so I can't really characterize it one way or the other except to say you're not supposed to use a word anymore, but you're supposed to refer to all the same constructs. So what we see is that I believe the incorrect use of Axis 2 diagnoses to explain suffering people who've had attachment difficulties. We do have to acknowledge that the symptoms that are attached to those labels are symptoms that our kids are suffering with constantly. But some of us have written and talked extensively about how calling it borderline personality disorder or calling it conduct disorder or calling it whatever it is, these are just labels for the endpoint of victimization, maltreatment, and disattunement and loss. And so, labels are fine. I teach labels at USC, the diagnostic labels, but we should remember that they're just a linguistic convention. They don't actually refer to people. They refer to an idea we have about how people tend to sort out symptomatically in different ways. And then a very big deal for us in working with adolescents has to do with their tendency to get into trouble. And getting into trouble is a good way to get booted out of the mental health system and into the forensic systems where you will be even more ignored and where you will be punished more. So in a culture that is relatively hierarchically organized and sees children as those who should be controlled if they're not behaving appropriately, what happens is the kids that are trying to express or externalize or engage in tension reduction behaviors to deal with their distress and pain are going to manifest in these problems, which are seen as more social than they are psychological. What I hope you'll hear today is we see them as psychological. So you look at things like, and we call these avoidance responses just in the sense that almost all of these, or all of these, involve some attempt by the individual to try to keep from being overwhelmed by the pain that they carry on a daily basis. If they don't have enough capacity to regulate their emotional states, if they have what we call decreased affect regulation ability, which happens when you are raised in invalidating, rejecting, and dangerous environments when you're little, you don't really learn how to control your emotionality or regulate it. And then you're carrying around more pain than the average person because of the world you found yourself in as a little kid. What happens when you become an adolescent is you have more pain than you have capacity to handle pain. And when this situation hits you, you're going to have to use avoidance strategies that bring pain, at least the perception of pain, down to a handleable level. So what we see with kids is a lot of getting into trouble, but what we would say is that what they're actually doing is engaging in adaptive behaviors. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's preaching that has to continue in all of our venues, which is to try to convert people's models of the bad kid, the juvenile delinquent kid, the criminal justice kid, and see that those kids are, in many, many cases, suffering the effects of unfair practices against them when they were young, including cultural dynamics that marginalize and deprive them, so that the effects that we have to take it back into psychology, not to pathologize it, but to recognize that when you're working with a person who's a line therapist at a residential treatment facility, and they're talking about all their acting out, seductive, manipulative, conduct disorder, borderline kids, that you will then invoke mindfulness strategies to bring down your autonomic hyperarousal, and then you will share with them the possibility that that kid is not actually doing bad things, that kid is suffering. So these are things including self-injury, which of course is very common in adolescents and young adults. Most research suggests self-injury starts at around 10, 11, 12, although we see earlier cases, and usually peaks at around 15, 16, 17, such that there are self-injuring 30-year-olds, but it's not nearly as common as older adolescents. Our groups have done a lot of research on self-injury, by the way, and feel free to go to my website, which is johnbriere.com. You can download all the papers and stuff that our various groups have done on these various topics. We're quite preoccupied with self-injury right now and have had some interesting experiences with that. Dysfunctional sexual behavior, which is just doing more or different sex than the culture wants you to do. So the problem we have is that we have a lot of rules about good sex, bad sex, right sex, wrong sex, which confuse us when we try to look at people who are either behaving in sexual ways that are perfectly normal, quote unquote, whatever that word means at this point in the evolution of our culture, but that are devalued by certain groups, therefore you shouldn't do certain things, etc. We have to partialize out of that, though, the fact that a lot of people use sexual interactions as a way to soothe themselves or calm themselves or have some kind of attachment connection. Those, unfortunately, are drives that are not going to ever be satiated. So what we see for a lot of kids is they're engaging in sexual activities to accomplish non-sexual goals, affirmation, even power, control, but also things like, do you love me? Can you connect with me? Am I okay? Those kinds of hungers, in the Buddhist tradition, we would call those hungry ghosts. You can't ever get full. So the problem that we have here is that these kids are going to continue to engage in those behaviors indefinitely. And then we will use unfair words like promiscuity, right? Promiscuity, as far as I can tell, I mean, I'm still studying the linguistic derivation, but as far as I can tell, promiscuity is what we call it when women and gay men do things that straight white males don't want them to do. So we have to be very careful that we don't use words like that. Not that they might not define some behavioral thing, but they're so socially loaded that we want to step away from there. Plus, you guys are not good arbiters of what's normal sexual behavior. Face facts. First of all, you're too damn old. Second of all, you live in a very weird culture. A very tiny little liberal mental health professional, nice outfits, letters after your name world. What do you guys know about free-ranging sexuality on the streets, right? So the problem is we will also impose our own cultural models under what's acceptable or not. On the other hand, any of us who work in HIV/AIDS, any of us who work in at-risk youth who are being exploited by the sex industry or other things, sexual behavior is a real big deal. So it's something we have to pay attention to, but it's something we have to pay a lot of attention to the dignity of the person stuck in that place and trying to find out ways to not say pejorative things about them or pathologicalize them based on our existing models. What we have to instead say is something like, you know, you're having multiple sex partners with very little attention to safety, and that is concerning because it could be associated with not your badness, but a viral disease, being re-victimized by people that you interact with who are not good for you, chaos. And I actually think probably too much sexual activity in the absence of love is probably not good for people. It probably makes us feel more empty and disengaged because of the roles that love and sex had for us evolutionarily. So a lot of people I see who have a lot of sexual contact with a lot of people are pretty empty inside. Which came first? Were they empty and they did that, or they did that and they were empty? I think the answer is yes. So what we have to do is see if we can work respectfully with people who suffer from those problems. Aggression obviously doesn't have to be psychological. It can be very social, but a lot of the kids that we see who get into low-level crime behaviors, it's because I think they have a limited number of ways they can express on a social domain the anger they feel, the frustration they feel, the horrible internally generated rage states associated with being treated unfairly. So even aggression, which does have some criminal justice qualities to it, should probably also be looked at these ways. Suicidality is obvious. Substance abuse. Now, substance abuse, we have a whole module on substance abuse. When we got funded by SAMHSA on this one, part of the writer for our work with SAMHSA was that we had to specialize or at least have a focus on treating substance abusing inner-city multi-traumatized adolescents, which we've done. So I don't think it might be with everything you have, I'm not sure, but certainly on the thumb drive if you got that, or you can go to our website, the ATC website, you can download our manual for free on treating multi-traumatized adolescents who have substance abuse issues. Because we don't have time to talk about it in this brief little thing, but you can imagine actually that substance abuse is a massive problem for a lot of complex traumatized kids. And actually probably our sort of blaming, accountability, make amends kind of analyses may not actually be helpful in the traditional way we understand it when we're working with kids who are in some ways, I would say, shoved into substance abuse. That's not our model. We think that they're just hedonistic kids trying to get high to have a good time. But when you take that bit apart and try to look at what's the actual motive for a lot of those behaviors, what you find are things like self-medication and ways to try to engage in drug abuse in the same way that a richer person would engage a psychiatrist in a Xanax prescription. And then obviously the whole notion of conduct disorder, early borderline traits. You know, Have you noticed that we treat PTSD, but we manage borderline personality disorder, we manage conduct disorder? Why do we treat PTSD and manage the other things? Because manage betrays the social agenda, which is control. So if you wake up some morning and the world wants to manage you, go back to sleep. Unless you're from LA, then it could be a good thing, but that's a whole entertainment thing that we're not going to talk about here. Although many people in the entertainment industry do come from the kinds of childhood histories we're talking about here, by the way. So I was wondering to myself, I was saying, John, how much should you talk about this in terms of the actual numbers you see there? I'm just going to rely on your reading abilities, but make some important points here. The United States is not an equal opportunity employer when it comes to the distribution of wealth and well-being in our culture. And I'm not going to get into political arguments here, and they're very complex arguments, and I don't find that's helpful anyway. But I think we do have to see where the rubber hits the road in terms of kids who were born into environments, into families, into skin color, into ethnicity, into gender orientation. Gender itself, were born into constructs that increase the likelihood they're going to have a difficult time. So what about that first line there? About a fifth of all the kids in America live beneath the poverty line. That's saying an awful lot. That poverty is associated with all kinds of psychological and social impacts, even controlling for child maltreatment. So the poverty rates are even higher among which groups? The groups that are the primary focus of ITCT-A, not because we tried to make it that way, but because the people who are suffering the most, who have complex trauma, who are kids, also come from economic marginalization, social marginalization phenomena. So what we find are higher rates of poverty in those groups. And then if you look at impoverished or marginalized kids, you see what their likelihood of running into situations are that may be to their detriment, that many of them are in child welfare, the majority of them may be in some kind of criminal justice system, a lot of them live in environments that are very dangerous. Again, it's gotten a little better than it used to be, but there's no question that we are involved in working with kids who had to step over a dead body to get to school, for example, or who didn't sleep last night because there was a drive-by shooting in their neighborhood, so they had to sleep in the bathtub because armor-piercing rounds can rarely pierce bathtubs. So you sleep in the bathtub overnight, and now it's 8 in the morning, your teacher wants you to pay attention, and you can't even hardly stay awake. So what we find is that the high-crime neighborhoods produce their own trauma. And there's a very major study in JAMA, that's probably the top journal in the world. It's now getting a little older, but this was by Singer et al., and basically found that just living in these environments brought people into nearly the post-traumatic stress level of suffering on a major psychological test. So just living in these environments was associated with lots of trauma, even, in fact, kids who had not been themselves shot or maltreated in whatever ways. And then a lot of these kids are in the community mental health system, as you see there. Interestingly, a lot of them didn't ask to be there, and this creates some interesting problems, as we'll talk about later. By the way, I put this website there, first of all, because we psychologists have to cite everything, but also because this is a great website. This is out of Columbia University, who does a lot of interesting stuff on social marginalization. They have a whole website on the impacts of poverty on kids, very high-level, empirically based, very nice stuff, and a lot of sub-pages. You can go off to all kinds of things within their website looking at the impacts of poverty for all these kids. And obviously also what's going to be true is that these kids have low access to treatment. That first line, I think, is very distressing, is it not? Now, by the way, this was developed not by people who were giving this keynote this morning, but who were just talking about the predicament for children and adolescents. The 75 to 80% of youth in these deprived environments need mental health services but do not receive them. Cheryl glossed over it this morning, but we had a trauma system funded for a long time in one of the most difficult inner city environments of Long Beach. At the time that was being funded, actually, the fire department would not attend to a fire unless they had a police escort. So it was that kind of an environment, and we were providing help to all these kids. Almost all those kids, we got them through outreach, through connection with other environments. And then when our funding was cut, which happens to everybody, it's very sad, all those kids in just a heartbeat were set free back in the universe. Very few of them, as far as we know, got re-hooked up with therapists, etc. It reminds you not only how tenuous life is and our circumstances are, but just how many of these kids were suffering out there, were gaining so much, and then lost it in a second tells us something about funding, but it also tells us that there's a massive amount of underserved population out there, and outreach, whatever we do, has to be a big piece of what we do. It may be to you, well, we have an 8-month waiting list, why should we do outreach? And I feel for you in that context. But the story still remains the same. Beyond your outreach, beyond your waiting list are a huge number of kids who are never going to come to anyone's attention. If they do come to anyone's attention, it'll probably be the juvenile justice system. So, and then there are going to be blocks to our treatment, that regular psychological treatment. If you do go to your average county outpatient clinic, et cetera, and you look at all these abused and neglected kids who are going and getting treatment, again, there's no use in blaming people. We're all doing the best we can given the hand we've been dealt. But the reality is that an awful lot of those kids are going to get generic, minor, glancing, occasional, and sporadic mental health interventions. They're primarily going to get medication. Medication is not always very efficacious with the kinds of problems we see here. Perhaps psychiatric medication itself has been a little overblown in our professions. So the reality is that you can't SSRI someone out of poverty, discrimination, marginalization, homophobia. It's just the drug class probably has a lot of benefits, but that may not be one of them. So the problem is that we end up providing treatment that may be not socially or culturally relevant to the child or the adolescent's experience. We may be using interventions that were developed for other groups. And we may, in fact, be a little bit like a factory. Have you ever felt like you're in a factory there, that you're processing widgets, next, 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 next? And, you know, where are these kids going after they have their 15 minutes with you or their hour with you once a week if they're extremely lucky, probably once a month? Are they actually getting treatment? We can go to sleep at night saying they got treatment. You know, it's an open question, but obviously there's going to be a lot of variability there in terms of some of our most alienated, hurt kids are probably getting very little help from our existing mental health system. And unfortunately, as I noted before, these kids are often going to get rooted to juvenile justice. They're going to be truant. They're going to have troubles in classes. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to be victimized. They're going to be using substances. They're going to be, quote, acting out. Acting out is a great word because it allows us to, we believe, not take a stand on what we're talking about. But acting out actually means something in Freudian psychology, and that's not what these kids are experiencing. What we're calling acting out is suffering. Suffering that's being expressed in ways that we don't especially like as a culture. You know, a lot of times the reason that kids get attention is because they're urinating on our lawn. The psychological equivalent of that. They're doing something that draws attention to them, so we want to fix it, so we provide either mental health or juvenile justice. If you've been in our juvenile justice systems, you know that there's a vast number of people in there that don't have any more psychological difficulties than most people who aren't in the juvenile justice system. They may have some, but the bottom line is they have the bad luck that their matrix of difficulties cause them to be attended to in a non-mental health way. And then obviously what we find here is that in a lot of the cultural matrices in which we're impacting, the culture, the parents of those kids may not believe in mental health services. They may be very avoidant of them, so it may be shameful that their kid's in trouble. Also, families that produce complex trauma kids usually have their own complex trauma in the parents and the siblings and others. They may be carrying cultural understandings back from other environments or American environments that cause them to victimize the kids in terms of in the name of parental discipline or whatever it might be. Even words like time out, which were originally developed by behavioral psychologists to provide a non-punitive option for kids who are engaging in unacceptable behaviors, time out has morphed in many environments to another form of neglect. Lock your kid up for 14 hours and call it time out, then you're okay. You know, we used to lock up Auntie May in the attic or the basement. Now we lock Esmeralda in her little bedroom or something. So a lot of the times what we have here is a tendency to move into punitive analyses, which are present, unfortunately, in the parenting of a lot of the kids that we see. Well, okay, so, hey, no problem. We'll just develop really good treatments for those kids. And that is obviously what we want to do. The problem we have right now is that the therapies that have been developed to treat kids right now, and I'm not going to use labels just because there's so much battle among different therapy originators about who's cool and who's uncool, who's doing the right thing. You know about that, right? You know, so it's kind of boring. But the reality is that an awful lot of the treatments that are being used right now to treat multi-traumatized youth were developed in highly screened populations. So if nowadays in journals, if you do a treatment outcome study, you have to talk about how many people you started with, how many people signed up, how many people stayed in the therapy, how many people improved. And it's a very depressing tree diagram. You've seen that? I think Bessel or Spinazzola or someone showed a study where there were like 1,000 people to start out with, and there were like 23 by the time they got to the end of treatment. So who are those 23? Do they have what we call ecological validity or external validity? That's a very unusual group, the ones who made it through treatment. Those are probably the ones that are not suffering very much, who are more congruent with the system that's trying to help them. And they're probably very brave or very inured to social processes that hung in there even when most people would probably run. So the question is, in the treatment outcome studies we see, are they actually generalizable to the people we treat? You know what? I have a secret. I know you already know it, but I'm going to share this secret with you. The therapies that you've been trained in to treat kids have so many exclusion criteria that the treatments that you're being told to apply to kids do not apply to the kids you're working with. In fact, your caseload was screened out of those studies. No, it really was. So the problem, and I could go into that, and I've written about that, I'm welcome to that. But the reality is, by the time you look at who got those treatments, they don't have anything to do with the people you're seeing. They screened out people with lots of trauma, with access to kinds of problems, with conduct disorder, with substance abuse, with dissociation, with more than 5 symptoms. There's even a well-known study, and I'm not going to say which one, using one of the major treatments to treat sexually reactive kids, where they removed every kid that was sexually reactive. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. So what do you got when you're done? You've got a treatment that works very well for the people who made it through the screening procedure. But even then, maybe 50% of those kids improved, 60%, 40%, it varies by study. So, I mean, that's way better than nothing. But we just have to start to step back from our cultural message that science knows the answer, that these highly controlled treatment outcome studies define truth. They do define truth, but what they define truth for is the people who finally made it into the study, who may not template very well on the people that you're working with. Another problem is that a lot of these treatments are very short term. How long is the average treatment, if you were to look them up on the web or if you've gone to a training, how long do they expect a child to be in therapy before their problems are, if you read the manual, are remediated or improved dramatically? It's usually 8 to 16 sessions. What's the problem? That kid spent 14 years getting to this place, is impacted by a variety of systems. I mean, what are the odds they're going to turn it around in 8 to 16 sessions? You know, in the torture world, I don't know if there are any torture therapists out there, but sometimes we say it takes a client 6 months to say hello. And by that we mean that if you've been tortured, you're not too happy about government. You're not too happy about clinicians who come from institutions. And you're actually not trusting anyway. So are you going to go, 18 sessions, 16 sessions, thank you very much. It may take that long for you to realize the person actually is there to help you as opposed to trying to control you in some kind of way. Well, this is clearly true from kids from the inner city who are suddenly airlifted into some therapeutic context that may not have much to do with them. They're not going to go, oh good, session 1. I can't wait to develop a trauma narrative. Right? Because, they're basically saying, are you or are you not an offender yourself? Your skin color, your social status, your class tells me that you are the people that hurt me. How long is it going to have for them to get a countervailing message if in fact you can send one? And then the whole issue of manualization, which is what you have to do if you're going to do a treatment outcome study. You have to very tight treatment models. This session do these things. But as a number of writers have pointed out, that was developed so that we could have scientifically studied studies. It wasn't, in fact, originally developed so that would be the way to treat people. In other words, we wanted to purify the intervention, make it very tight, one size fits all, so that everybody got the same thing. Then you could say the same thing that everybody got was or was not efficacious. The problem here is that a lot of our clients, again, don't have the common courtesy to have read the treatment manual. So you're now on session 2, and they're still on session 1. Or you're talking about the crisis of the week, and they're talking about their lives. So one of the problems that we find here is that the manualized treatments, although they have a lot of basis for them, and Randy Semple and I developed a manualized treatment for burn survivors. I'm not saying you never do it, but the problem with manualized treatment is it doesn't give enough flexibility to the client and the therapist. It also doesn't have what I've started to write about in the methodology research, extendability, which is once you've worked through your manual and you're now on session 12, your client's only 11% better. Now what do? Do you say, well, we've given you treatment, you're not better, therefore it's something wrong with you that we can't address? You know, what you want to be able to do is have a 13th session if necessary, or a 17th session. So there has to be a way the model can step outside of itself. And so manualization, although again, many benefits, has this problem of being relatively rigid and relatively constrained in what you're allowed to do. In fact, don't get me started. In fact, the whole notion of fidelity, you familiar with fidelity? So did you do what the manual said you were supposed to do? I don't know, fidelity sounds more like some kind of heterosexual constraint on mammalians to me. I don't know what it has to do with that. But, you know, the reality is, so you got a client and it's doing so-and-so, and the therapist goes, oh my God, that feels so bad. And the person rating that therapy behind the video goes, stepped out of the model. Stepped out of the model. So, and I'm overstating because that's my tendency, but it could be that the really good work is outside the model. So fidelity may not always be what it's cracked up to be. We don't like the word fidelity, but it could be childhood authority issues. And then obviously they're not going to have a lot of cultural adaptation. So where would we like to go from here? What we would like to do is see if we can develop models that realize that psychological problems presenting in these kids are not necessarily criminal justice issues. They may not even be out of our textbooks of how kids develop psychological problems, because the issue that we have is that much of our developmental, the growth of our field on how to treat hurt kids, that's not what they say. If you pick up the average textbook on child psychiatry, psychology, or adolescent psychology, psychiatry, they don't say how to work with hurt kids. What they do is they talk about models that were developed in the relative absence of trauma understanding, even new ones. So the more traditional the manual you see, the more likely it is to be published by one of the APAs or by some other august body of white guys in Washington, D.C. That the function of that ultimately is going to be that it's going to take trauma-related phenomena and call it something else. And that's not just a social convention or linguistic convention. It pulls us away from the etiology. So what we're seeing now, and it's a very exciting time, and I think in the human history of mental health development, is the notion of focusing on trauma as a unit analysis instead of focusing on the kid's problems from an outside-in perspective, saying, oh, you must have a diagnosis, you may have done this, you may have done that. So we have, for instance, the NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, funded by SAMHSA, a revolutionary idea. I wish we had more time. Basically, a bunch of people got together and said, let's throw a huge amount of money into the treatment of traumatized kids in America. Very unlikely to have occurred. I don't think it would occur in the current congressional matrix if it was being initiated now. There was an act of great compassion and therefore highly suspect, but it did happen, and it continues to be promulgated. So the NCTSN is actually the best evidence we have that our culture can take things seriously and can try to do things. They're spending millions and millions of dollars every year trying to help hurt kids. The problem, of course, is that's just one little component of one little part of the mechanism of funding for mental health. So probably what we want to do is see if we can develop innovative treatment models. Can we try not to take anyone out of the therapy? So, I'm not trying to say ITCT-A is brilliant. It's not. It's just an attempt to try to fix things. So we can say we tried to fix things. Whether it works or not, I think it works a little bit, but like anything, it's only the best it can be right now. It will continue to be developed. But can we eliminate exclusion criteria? So there are no exclusion criteria for ITCT-A other than you're very, very psychotic. Okay. Which eliminates most of people like me, but it's fine for the kids. And we use components-based models rather than package models. Have you heard that discrimination? All it means is that in components-based models, you look at the kid, you assess them, you try to figure out what's up with them, and then you provide empirical treatments that are helpful for those specific problems. You don't give them treatment for things that they don't have problems with. So that one-size-fits-all approach, which is the package approach, give them this treatment, is going to always be somewhat inaccurate because no given kid's going to have all the problems. One kid comes to see you and they're cutting on themselves, they're dissociated, they're substance abusing, engaging in high rates of sexually problematic contact. Another kid is alone all the time, post-traumatic stress and depressed with a lot of emptiness. Those two kids come from the same relatively the same abusive context, but they're not going to respond to the same treatments. So some people are going to need some treatments. So sometimes called the cafeteria approach. Components approaches say, assess the person really well and then figure out what could you do to help that person. That's what ITCT-A and C has been all about since its since it was originally created. And then adapt. Make adjustments for the cultural matrix of the kids you find yourself working with. You know, I believe actually that if you work in LA, you should be able to speak Spanish. If you can't speak Spanish, you should probably at least have some understanding of the sociology of immigration and have understanding of the culture enough so that these people don't look to you like aliens when actually they're the people that were here before you were anyway. And, right, and they've got, that wasn't an applause line, but thank you. You know, you're trying to help a domain that you don't know the territory of. So I'm not saying go out and take Spanish tomorrow, but I'm saying if you work with Hmong refugees in Chicago, study Hmong people. Study the history of indigenous Vietnamese people. You know, just have a little bit of background so you can do these things. And then Cheryl talks about this all the time. I try to as well, which is every single ITCT-A component can be adjusted for different cultural models. You know, if you're giving people a white middle-class picket fence model and they live in the barrio or something, it's just not going to work because there's not going to be enough cultural communality there. And lastly, I guess, it is trauma to be treated in a racist or sexist or homophobic way. Well, maybe you could argue that. But the ITCT-A perspective would say that time that you were treated in such a horrible macro or microaggressive way by the culture who didn't respond to you in appropriate ways because of your gender or your ethnicity or whatever, that was abuse. That was maltreatment. And we have to call it that if we want to get somewhere further. By the way, this increases your creds in therapy. If you're acknowledging the experience that people are having outside of your little DSM categories to say, what is it like for you to grow up speaking a language that the dominant culture doesn't speak? Or that light refracts off your skin at a frequency that other people don't like so much. You know, what is it like to be born that way and to grow up that way? So we're going to have to be very sensitive in attending to those issues as they arise. So welcome to today. That's basically what we're going to do today, probably in less polemic ways. But thanks for coming. It's really great to see all you guys here. Bye-bye.